Imagine it's 15th of November 1923. You're a 42-year-old school teacher living in Berlin, Germany. You rent a narrow apartment near Alexanderplatz with your wife, your son, and your daughter, and in the kitchen cupboard sits a small tin box filled with paper savings you once believed would buy a better stove and piano lessons. Every morning you button the same wool coat, walk past tram lines and coal smoke, buy bread on the way to school, and spend the evening grading essays under a weak lamp while your wife stretches soup to feed 4 people. Your salary still arrives in thick stacks of banknotes, and on paper it looks larger every week. A few years ago, that would have felt like progress. Now it feels like rainwater filling a sinking boat. If you have ever wondered why some forms of wealth seem to melt in a crisis, while others come through scarred but standing, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern buried in a century of panic. And if this kind of historical clarity helps you see the world differently, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. That morning, before the first lesson begins, another teacher rushes into the staff room and says the price of bread has changed again. By lunch, the number has changed once more. By the time school ends, the money in your pocket buys less than it did at sunrise. You are not lazy. You are not foolish. You did what responsible people are told to do. You worked, saved, planned, and trusted the notes in your hand and the promises behind them. But the floor has given way beneath the house, and now you're learning a brutal lesson that people in Argentina, Zimbabwe, Cyprus, Greece, and Lebanon would later learn in their own way. In times of inflation and panic, the question is not simply who has money. The question is what kind of claim they really own when trust begins to die. This video is about which assets have tended to survive those moments, which ones usually fail first, and why the difference has shaped the lives of ordinary people for more than 100 years. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Inflation and panic do not destroy wealth in some equal, fair, mechanical way. They rearrange it. They move it often fast and often quietly from one set of hands to another. Think of society as a theater built from promises. Cash is a ticket. A bank deposit is a ticket with the bank's name on it. A government bond is a ticket with the state's name on it. A pension is a ticket tied to rules that someone else must still honor years from now. Most of the time, the audience never notices the building materials. The lights are on, the orchestra plays, the seats feel solid, but when inflation rises or panic starts, people stop admiring the curtains and start kicking the beams. That is when the difference between paper claims and real claims matters. A paper claim is something that depends on somebody else paying you in a currency that still holds value. A real claim is tied more directly to something people still need even when fear spreads. Food, energy, land, productive businesses, hard currency from outside the system, or a scarce metal that people across borders will still recognize. This does not mean every house is safe, every stock is safe, or every gold coin is magical. Survival depends on what exactly the asset is, where it is held, whether it can be sold, and what it is priced in. But history shows the same broad rule again and again. When confidence breaks, symbols suffer first. Substance suffers later, and sometimes far less. Inflation is like heat under an ice sculpture. Panic is like a stampede toward the exit. If your wealth is made of ice or trapped behind the wrong door, it can vanish in full view. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. When the currency itself is failing, assets tied to real things usually survive better than savings tied to the failing unit of account. A unit of account is just the measuring stick for prices. If the measuring stick is shrinking by the hour, every plan made with it starts to blur. Weimar Germany is the most famous example because it was so extreme that it feels unreal. Before the First World War, $1 US bought just over 4 German marks. By 1920, the mark had already lost most of its old value. By July 1922, according to Britannica, prices had risen by about 700%. Then the pace became insane. By November 1923, quoted exchange rates had reached into the trillions of marks for $1. People remembered the absurd details because absurd details were all they had left. One student recalled ordering a cup of coffee for 5,000 marks, and then a second cup for 7,000 marks a few minutes later. Shopkeepers could not replace stock fast enough. Farmers refused to hand over produce for money that looked official in the morning and worthless by nightfall. Pensioners starved. Food riots broke out. The democratic state itself began to look like a stage set made of painted cardboard. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Not everybody lost in the same way. The great losers were people whose lives were organized around fixed claims. Teachers, clerks, pensioners, families with savings accounts, people who had done what respectable society told them to do. They were holding numbers. But numbers inside a collapsing currency behave like shadows at sunset. You can see them, you cannot hold them. Now look at what happened on the other side. Industrialist Hugo Stinnes became known as the inflation king. Why? because he borrowed in marks and used those borrowed marks to buy real assets: coal mines, factories, shipping interests, newspapers. His debts stayed fixed in paper while the paper itself died. The assets did not become painless or perfect. Germany was still in chaos, but a coal mine was still a coal mine. A ship was still a ship. Land still yielded crops. Buildings still sheltered tenants. A business that sold something people needed could keep repricing, which means changing its prices fast enough to keep up with the falling currency. In a storm of paper, claims on real output became heavy stones, while savings notes became autumn leaves. This is the first major pattern. In inflation, what survives best tends to be whatever can move with the price level instead of being trapped beneath it. Gold did this in many episodes because it was recognized far beyond one state. Foreign currency did this because its value was not tied to the local printing press. Productive land did this because wheat, milk, coal, timber, and rent were still part of daily life. Debtors with fixed obligations sometimes did well for the same reason, which sounds backward until you see the mechanism clearly. Inflation can function like acid on contracts. It burns the side that is owed fixed money and relieves the side that owes fixed money, at least until the rules are changed. There's a cruel moral twist here. The people hurt most were often the disciplined, the cautious, the dutiful. The winners were not always wiser in some grand sense. Sometimes they were simply closer to real assets, faster to spend, or already insulated by class and access. In Weimar Germany, ordinary workers ran from the pay window to the shops because waiting even a few hours could matter. Imagine a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Saving in marks was like trying to carry water home in that bucket. Ownership of something real was like owning the well. Before we move to the next case, remember the deepest lesson from Berlin. Inflation did not just make prices go up. It changed what counted as wealth. It exposed the difference between owning a promise and owning something that can live outside the promise. Before we go further, here's something I want you to think about. If your bank statement shows money, but the bank will not let you take it out freely, are you still wealthy? Or are you only reading a story on a screen? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what happened next in Argentina is the part that turns a banking problem into a social earthquake. Argentina in 2001 and 2002 teaches the second major point. In a panic, where your asset sits can matter almost as much as what the asset is. A dollar in your hand is not the same as a dollar in a stressed bank. On paper, they look identical. In history, they often turn into different species. For a decade, Argentina had tied the peso to the US dollar at 1-to-1. That peg looked like discipline. It looked like certainty. It looked like a ruler nailed to the wall. But under the floorboards, debts were growing. Recession was deepening, and confidence was thinning out like old fabric. By late 2001, depositors were pulling money out. The Yale case study notes that by November, peso deposits had fallen by more than 1/3 and dollar deposits by about 1/10. More than 2/3 of Argentine bank deposits were denominated in dollars. Everyone thought they understood what that meant. Then December arrived, and history informed them that they did not. On 1st December 2001, the government imposed the corralito. That word sounds almost harmless. In plain English, it was a fence. Withdrawals from demand deposit accounts were limited to 250 pesos, or $250 per week per account holder. The purpose was to stop the run. The effect was to trap millions of people inside the very system they no longer trusted. Within weeks, riots spread. President Fernando de la Rua resigned. During the bank holiday that followed, Argentina defaulted on about $141 billion of foreign debt, one of the largest sovereign defaults in history. On 6th of January 2002, Congress ended the 1-to-1 convertibility system. Dollar deposits were converted into pesos at 1.4 per dollar by decree, while the market value of the dollar moved much higher. What did ordinary people live through? Not an abstract chart, a daily humiliation. The middle class banged pots and pans in the streets because savings they believed were liquid, which means ready to use, had turned into museum pieces behind glass. The World Bank reported that poverty rose from 37% in 2001 to 58% by the end of 2002. The number of people below the indigence line, meaning extreme poverty, doubled. Unemployment stayed painfully high at 18%. Families cut food spending, bought cheaper brands, sold assets, delayed payments, and sent more household members out to work. That is what panic looks like on the ground. It is not only riots, it is smaller meals, postponed medicine, and parents pretending not to be afraid. Now here is where it gets interesting. The people who held bank balances learned that the word balance can lie. A bank deposit is not cash sitting in a labeled drawer. It is a claim on a bank. And if the bank is entangled with a state under pressure, that claim can be fenced, delayed, converted, taxed, or quietly shrunk. Meanwhile, Argentines who held physical dollars outside the banking system, or had income tied to exports, or owned assets that could reprice after devaluation, found themselves in a very different position from those trapped in peso wages and frozen accounts. The same currency name sat on different sides of a wall. This is why bank panic is not just about solvency, a word that means the ability to pay what is owed. It is about access. It is about time. It is about who can move and who cannot. A small business owner with inventory might raise prices and keep operating. A family with cash dollars hidden at home had options. A farmer selling into world markets was living in the same country but on a different economic planet from a salaried worker staring at an ATM screen. In crisis, wealth is like water in winter. Some of it still flows, some of it freezes in the pipe. Argentina also reveals a counterintuitive fact that most people miss. The safer an asset appears in calm times, the more dangerous it can become if everyone relies on the same legal structure at once. A bank balance feels cleaner than cash in a drawer. A neat digital number feels more modern than a stack of notes. But modernity is not the same as resilience. If the whole bridge depends on confidence, the polished railing does not matter much when the cables snap. This leads to the third part of the story. Sometimes inflation and panic combine so completely that people stop thinking in the local currency at all. They start thinking in goods, in foreign notes, in bus rides, in meals, in liters of fuel. That happened in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation was not a sudden lightning strike. It was more like termites in the beams, chewing for years until the roof finally sagged in public. The core mechanism was painfully clear. The government spent money it did not have, and the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe financed that spending by creating more money. Cato described it in blunt terms. The source of the hyperinflation was the money machine. Official inflation reached 165,000% year over year in February 2008. By early June 2008, unofficial estimates put annual inflation around 2.5 million percent. The Zimbabwe dollar lost more than 99.9% of its value against the US dollar in a year. Later estimates put the annual inflation peak in November 2008 at 89.7 sextillion percent. A sextillion is such a huge number that it barely feels like language anymore. That is the point. Hyperinflation is what happens when money stops being a measuring tool and becomes noise. What did this mean for ordinary life? It meant wages that could not survive the trip home. It meant shops without stock and stock without stable prices. It meant millions of Zimbabweans leaving the country. It meant living standards falling by 38% between 1997 and 2007, according to Cato. It meant the rituals of normal life becoming impossible. A salary budget needs a week. Hyperinflation can erase value in a day. Planning becomes a joke told by yesterday. And yet, even here, not everything failed equally. Assets linked to the local currency were crushed first. Cash savings in Zimbabwe dollars were wiped out. Fixed salaries lagged. Formal accounts became less useful than immediate exchange. But people who could access US dollars, South African rand, or goods that others needed were operating with something closer to real money. A bag of maize meal, a tank of fuel, spare parts, gold, livestock, a shop with inventory, a relative sending remittances from abroad. These were not magical protections, but they were closer to life than a note losing zeros by the hour. When Zimbabwe officially allowed multiple foreign currencies in early 2009, the local currency was effectively pushed aside because daily life had already voted against it. Reuters reported that after the government abandoned its worthless currency, consumer prices actually fell month to month for a time, and officials said the Zimbabwe dollar would stay out until there was real production to support it. That line matters. Real production. Not speeches, not slogans, not denominations with more zeros. Real production is the engine. Currency is the claim ticket on that engine. If the ticket printer goes wild while the engine stalls, the tickets do not become wealth. They become litter. There is another hard lesson here. In extreme inflation, people do not merely protect purchasing power. They protect timing. They try to shorten the gap between earning and spending, between selling and restocking, between receiving money and converting it into something more durable. In calm times, patience is a virtue. In hyperinflation, delay can be a tax. Money becomes an ice cube on a hot road. The longer you hold it, the smaller it gets. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. The same mechanism. Different countries, different decades, same result. In Weimar Germany, the unit of account died. In Argentina, access to the banking system was fenced off. In Zimbabwe, both money and confidence collapsed so badly that people abandoned the local currency in practice and then in law. But under those different costumes, the same play was on stage. First, a state or banking system makes more promises than it can safely keep. Sometimes the promises are fiscal, meaning tied to government spending and debt. Sometimes they are monetary, meaning tied to the currency itself. Sometimes they are banking promises, where deposits look available, but only if not everyone asks for them at once. Then something breaks trust. It may be inflation. It may be recession. It may be capital flight, which means money rushing out of the country. It may be a political shock. Once trust cracks, people stop valuing the promise at face value. They begin to ask a harsher question. What can I get for this now, outside the story the system tells about itself? At that point, paper claims are tested first, cash in the weakening currency, bank deposits trapped in the stressed system, bonds paying fixed amounts in shrinking money, pensions adjusted too slowly, wages renegotiated too late. Those are the first floors to buckle. Assets tied to real output, scarce goods, or harder currencies, usually bend later. Sometimes they even rise because people rush toward them. Gold is one example, but not because it is mystical. Gold survives many crises because it is scarce, widely recognized, and no central bank can print it overnight. Foreign currency survives because it is a claim on a different political and monetary system. Land, commodities, and productive businesses survive better when they keep supplying something people need and can reprice. The key is not glamour. The key is distance from the failing promise and closeness to real demand. There is also an important warning. No asset survives every crisis in every way. A house can be taxed, damaged, or impossible to sell. A business can be ruined by recession or controls. Gold can swing violently in price. Foreign cash can be stolen, banned, or simply inconvenient. Even stocks, which are pieces of real businesses, can be terrible protection if the companies are overloaded with debt or blocked from raising prices. What survives is not one magic object. What survives is usually a type of claim. Flexible, scarce, portable, productive, and not trapped inside the exact structure that is failing. A milder version of this pattern appeared even in the United States during the Great Inflation. The Federal Reserve dates that era from 1965 to 1982. Inflation rose from a little over 1% in 1964 to more than 14% in 1980. The Fed later concluded that excessive money growth, fiscal strain, policy errors, and oil shocks all played a role. During the 1973 to 1979 stretch, CME notes that inflation averaged about 8.8% a year, while gold returned roughly 35% annually. That does not mean gold always wins. It means that when trust in money and policy weakens, people often move toward assets they believe sit outside that weakness. Once policy credibility returns, the picture changes. Gold protects against broken confidence more reliably than it protects against every headline about rising prices. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Inflation and panic are not only price events, they are sorting events. They separate claims that depend on calm from claims that still matter under stress. And once you see the pattern, the next question becomes human, not theoretical. Who gets hit first? Usually not the billionaire with lawyers in 3 jurisdictions. Usually not the large exporter paid in hard currency. Usually not the industrialist loaded with real assets and political access. The people in the blast zone are more often middle-class savers, pensioners, wage earners, and small business owners whose working capital is locked in the wrong place. Look at Lebanon after 2019. Reuters described a system built for years on debt, remittances, and remarkable interest rates that drew in fresh dollars. Some economists compared it to a nationally regulated Ponzi scheme, meaning new money was needed to honor old promises. The peg to the dollar looked stable at 1 out of 1,500 Lebanese pounds for more than 2 decades. Then inflows dried up. In October 2019, protests erupted, foreign exchange disappeared, and banks no longer had enough dollars for depositors lining up outside. The banks shut their doors. Reuters said savers were locked out of dollar accounts or told that funds they could access were worth only a fraction of the original amount. By late January 2022, the street exchange rate had fallen to about £23,000 to the dollar after hitting $34,000 earlier that month. In another Reuters report from September 2022, 7 banks were held up in a matter of days by depositors seeking their own money. One man, Abed Subra, said he wanted access to $300,000 of savings in cash. Others got partial payouts. $15,000 here, $20,000 there, $25,000 somewhere else. Imagine what it means for society when people start staging armed dramas to recover their own deposits. That is not just financial crisis. That is trust falling out of the social ceiling. Look also at Cyprus in March 2013. After heavy losses tied to Greek debt and worsening bank runs, authorities announced a rescue plan. Electronic transfers were shut down to prevent money fleeing. Parliament rejected the first levy plan, and then Cyprus imposed a bank holiday that lasted 10 days. Uninsured depositors in the most troubled banks were frozen and ultimately bailed in, which means their money was used to recapitalize the banks. Reuters later reported that Bank of Cyprus seized 47.5% of uninsured deposits above 100,000 euros and converted them into equity. Think about the lesson there. A deposit above an insurance threshold is not merely a bigger deposit. In a crisis, it can become bank capital wearing your name tag. Then, Greece in June 2015. Banks shut. Capital controls went up. Reuters reported daily ATM withdrawals were limited to 60 euros. 60 euros. For many viewers, that is a grocery run. For a family business trying to buy supplies, it can be suffocation by paperwork. For pensioners and salary earners, it is the feeling of a whole nation breathing through a straw. And this is where history gets especially harsh. The people who trusted the system most deeply were often the least prepared for the speed of the change. The saver with one domestic bank, the retiree on a fixed income, the shop owner whose cash flow depended on daily access to deposits, the teacher whose wages were paid in the weakening unit, the small landlord whose tenants fell behind. They were not reckless. They were concentrated. Their lives were built like a house with one staircase. When smoke filled that staircase, there was no second exit. Meanwhile, those who came through relatively intact were rarely untouched, but they often had one of several advantages. Some had assets beyond the domestic banking wall. Some had foreign income. Some owned things that could be sold or repriced quickly. Some had gold or jewelry held directly. In Lebanon, the Associated Press reported that as trust in banks collapsed, people lined up outside precious metals dealers to buy gold and silver coins, bars, and medallions. Lebanon's central bank still held 286 tons of gold, about 9 million ounces, and for many families, gold jewelry was not just decoration, but emergency savings. One Lebanese woman told AP that if a woman faces a hard situation, she can sell her gold. That is not romance. That is a portable balance sheet. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So, what did the survivors tend to do across very different places and times? Not perfectly, not heroically, but consistently enough that the pattern is hard to miss. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. First, they were less dependent on one fragile promise. That could mean foreign currency outside the domestic banking system, as in Argentina. It could mean direct ownership of gold or jewelry, as many Lebanese families preferred. It could mean assets with global prices, like export crops or commodities. It could mean a business that sold necessities and could adjust prices fast. The common feature was not sophistication, it was distance. They were standing at least partly outside the room where the fire began. Second, they owned claims tied to real human needs. Coal, wheat, fuel, rent, transport, inventory, hard currency, metal, productive land, a business with customers. In Weimar Germany, Hugo Stinnes did not survive by loving paper more than everyone else. He survived by using paper to buy reality before the paper died. In Zimbabwe, people with access to goods, remittances, or foreign notes had a bridge back to daily commerce. In inflation, productive assets are like trees with living roots. Their leaves may blow around in the storm, but the roots still draw from the ground. Third, they kept flexibility. Flexibility is not a glamorous word, but history treats it like a life jacket. The winners, if that word can even be used, were often those who could move quickly, reprice quickly, shift currency quickly, or avoid forced selling. They did not need every asset to be liquid all at once. They did not rely on a weekend policymaker to preserve the full meaning of a digital balance. Their structure gave them time, and time is one of the rarest assets in a panic. There's a counterweight to all of this. Survivors were not always morally superior. Sometimes they were simply better placed. Sometimes they were richer to begin with. Sometimes they had political access or foreign passports or relatives abroad. History is not a neat self-help story. It is a record of asymmetry, which means uneven advantage. But even after you allow for that, the same broad fact remains. People who relied entirely on fixed local claims usually suffered most. People with at least part of their wealth in portable, real, or externally anchored claims usually had more room to breathe, and that room matters. Because the first goal in these episodes is often not profit. It is continuity. Can you buy food? Can you pay rent? Can you keep a business open? Can you avoid selling the family future for today's emergency? Assets that survive inflation and panic are often the ones that keep options alive. They are lifeboats, not speedboats. Now return to Berlin. The school teacher from the opening scene does not become an inflation king. He does not buy coal mines. He's an ordinary man. And ordinary men usually do not get advance notice when the beams begin to crack. His salary keeps arriving. His savings keep shrinking. His wife learns to spend money the moment it enters the house. Perhaps they barter household goods. Perhaps relatives in the countryside help with food. Perhaps the piano lessons vanish first, then the better stove, then the idea that steady work automatically leads to steady security. That is what inflation and panic really steal. Not only purchasing power, not only savings, they steal sequence, the order in which a normal life is supposed to unfold. History shows that the assets most likely to survive these moments have usually shared one trait. They remain claims on something people still want when trust in money, banks, or policy begins to fail. Sometimes that is gold. Sometimes it is foreign currency. Sometimes it is productive land, inventory, energy, export income, or ownership in businesses that can keep selling through the storm. And history shows that the assets least likely to survive are often the ones that seem safest in quiet times. Large cash balances in a weakening currency, fixed claims trapped in stressed banks, pensions, or bonds that adjust too slowly, and any promise that depends completely on a system already cracking under its own weight. The point is not to worship any one asset. The point is to understand the mechanism. Wealth survives when it is tied to reality more tightly than it is tied to a failing promise. Collapse is not a single explosion. It is a bridge losing bolts one by one until suddenly everyone can hear the river below. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.